Hello everyone, welcome back to My Hero Academia Podfics. Today I'll be starting a new fic entitled Research to Rescue. This is by KingofPillows on AO3. Here's the summary. Shota Aizawa is an underground pro-hero. Taking a mission to go undercover in Japan's biggest mafia was one of the worst things he could have done. Then he learned someone he thought was his biggest threat was anything but. Discovering what bound a big-hearted child to a life of evil was what turned this job as a mole into a research mission. Izuku Midoriya, a quirkless and weak child, had always wanted to be a hero ever since he was a kid. With orders from his father, he was now the Rabbit, a well-known assassin for Japan's biggest mafia. Saddled with 2.5 quirks of his very own, and a long list of sins on his back, he knows he'd never be someone worth being called a hero. Then someone tells him he's worth something, and all of it falls apart. Chapter 1. My childhood could have gone better, and here's why. Turning 6 was not the biggest accomplishment that one could make. Turning 10, now that's an accomplishment, a whole decade under your belt. 13, now you're a preteen, and can watch PG-13 movies. 15 or 16 has some rite of passage like a driver's license or something. 18, you're an adult. 21, you can drink. 30, welcome to middle age club. 100, good job. But 6? Not a whole lot can be said there. Well, for Izuku, turning 6 was less about age and more about what happened on the actual birthday itself. It had started out normal enough. He got an All Might hoodie that year, and his mom even made him a small cake for the two of them. It had always been just the two of them. It was a good day. They were happy and content with their small lives in a small apartment in a big city, and then they weren't. Someone knocked on the door sometime after dark. Izuku was allowed to stay up an extra hour, so he was in the living room watching a hero interview with his mother. Inko had told him about it, that it was fine. Probably a neighbor just coming home late to wish him a happy birthday as she went to go answer it. The doorknob had barely been turned when the door was slammed open. The next thing Izuku knew, there was a tall, intimidating man standing in the middle of the living room, hands behind his back and eyes staring down at the boy like he was a bug sitting too close to his morning coffee. Izuku had stared back wide-eyed and afraid. The man glanced at the hero on TV, sneered, and shut it off. Then his cold eyes were back on Izuku. The look on his face would soon become a common one. Inko had walked up behind the couch and protectively held Izuku's shoulder, probably to reassure him that he was fine, before starting to talk to the man like he wasn't welcome. Saying something about the man promising to stay away, how he dropped contact, his eagerness to do so before, how he had no right to pick it up now. The man only scowled and turned his sharp gray eyes at Inko. The disdain and impatience in his face was clear. "He's my son, too. I should be able to see him." "You wanted nothing to do with him before now, Hisashi." Inko had never sounded so venomous before that. The way she spat his father's name sounded like it could kill him if it was possible. If Izuku had looked up, he'd be sure that his mother would be glaring daggers at him. "I've had a change of heart. Izuku's young. He needs a strong father figure in his life." "Anyone would be a better figure than you." Hisashi sighed, and his expression changed. Something more natural, neutral, and calculating. He looked at Izuku, then back up at Inko. He then had a small smile and gave a soft, one-note laugh that was anything but genuine. His tone was at least faking amusement when he said, "A figure is a figure, right?" When he got no answer, Hisashi frowned. His tone switched to dead serious in the next second. "Inko, I'm not leaving without the boy. You can either hand him over to me, and no one here gets hurt, or we can take him by force." Hisashi swept his hand out to gesture to the two men that were standing by the door, and the two standing inside. "It's the age-old, easy way, or the hard way." Inko stared at the man, looked down at Izuku before sighing and letting go of the boy's shoulder. Hisashi smiled. His smile was wiped, though, as Inko's hand shot out and a vase collided with his face. Hisashi shouted as the thin glass had met his cheek. Dark smoke started to trickle out of his mouth as he looked back at Inko. One hand on his cheek was quickly starting to turn red. He looked at the blood and then back at her. Big mistake. The next scene was an honest blur to Izuku. There was shouting, some breaking, a bloom of fire as someone hit the ground. Izuku was pulled from his seat and carried under someone's arm like a sleeping bag, carried away from his home as he kicked and screamed to be let go. He remembered seeing his mom on the ground gripping her shoulder and trying to get up as Hisashi walked away. saying something that sounded like a threat. He was thrown into the back seat of a car, something was pressed against his face before he could dart for the door, and the world went dark. Izuku had woken up in a plain white bedroom. It was shaped like someone cut a can in half and set it on a small box. If not for the round ceiling maybe 5 feet above him, the room would have been a perfect square. Or maybe it was a rectangle. No windows. Only a bright fluorescent light in the middle of the ceiling provided any source of light at all. Everything in there was white. From the walls, the tile floor, the desk, and the chair. It was small, too. Smaller than his bedroom at home. The blanket he was laying on top of was also a stark white, much like the pillow. The bed frame was metal. Only colors it reflected were his skin and hair. His clothes now switched for a white shirt and shorts. His socks were missing, too. It was hard to look around at anything. The now 6-year-old boy had immediately sat up and looked around, spotting the only other color, a gray metal door centered with the wall. He got up and pulled at the handle. Nothing. He pushed it. Nothing. Exhausting his options, he tried to slide it like a classroom door. This actually worked. It slid fast enough to knock Izuku to the side. As he started to get up, proud of his accomplishment, the feeling instantly died. Someone had taken a step into the room, hands folded behind her back as she looked down at Izuku. She couldn't be older than 23. Eyes of piercing gold and silver hair fell to her waist as it waved. Pulled into a ponytail, her posture was eerily straight. Tiny patches of dark purple scales littered the sides of her neck and the back of her jawline. A long, iridescent lizard-like tail. From Izuku's angle, it looked dark purple. It flicked behind her like an impatient cat, the curve hovering just above the floor. She wore black slacks and a vest, a white button-down shirt, and a silver necktie. "Get up," she hissed. Her voice was cold. Izuku hesitated before getting up completely to his feet. The woman waited until he was up before turning on her heel and leaving the room, expecting Izuku to follow. He did. The walk was quiet as the two were followed by the 2 broad-shouldered young men with hardening quirks. That much Izuku found out when he looked back and both of them had hardened their arms, in some way as a threat to keep going. The woman's heels were the only other source of noise, as Izuku turned back to the woman and hesitantly asked, "Where am I?" The woman glanced back at him over her shoulder and looked forward again. "The base of the silver gyre." "Where's my mom?" "She's safe. For now." Izuku took a moment to really understand that it was a threat before asking, "Who are you?" "I am Yukio." Yukio wouldn't answer any other questions after that. She led him to a large room with what looked to be all sorts of medical equipment inside. People were buzzing around the room dressed like they were doctors. A few stopped when they entered just to set their eyes on Izuku. "This him?" asked a woman as she adjusted a pair of round glasses. Something was in her stare that made him uncomfortable. Yukio nodded briefly as Izuku blindly held a hand out to grab part of her pant leg in some self-comforting gesture. She stepped away before he could touch her. She made him feel better than these people did, even if in the few minutes he'd known her, she was intimidating and cold. Yukio shot a glare at the boy, and her tail moved quick to smack his hand away. Izuku crossed his arms and took a step backwards, bumping into the leg of one of the men with the hardening quirks. He pushed Izuku forward again, as one of the doctors, a tall man with a cat-like face, walked over and grabbed his arm. "Hisashi said to do as you like, just get the results before the new year." Yukio turned as Izuku was pulled away from the door by his upper arm. She was gone, with the 2 men that had arrived with them now guarding the closed door. Izuku was dragged to a metal table and sat atop it. Someone nearby held a stopwatch and a clipboard while the tall cat man had asked questions. "What's your name?" "Midori Izuku." "What's your age?" I just turned 6. "What's your quirk?" "I don't have one." The cat man looked at someone else who stood behind the table. The person seized his shoulders while the cat man took a step back, picked something off the table behind him, and grabbed Izuku's wrist as he came back. The man pulled Izuku's arm until it was straight out. A large needle was now hovering dangerously close to his forearm, and the hands on his shoulders were keeping him from jerking away. This was not going to end well. He might have been 8 years old when the technical team finally got the results they were looking for. Before then, Izuku only caught bits and pieces of what they were using him for. Something about artificial quirks. They were trying to find a way to force a whole new power into someone's body, to add to the ones that they had before. One not in their genetic line. In Izuku's case, they were trying to give him a quirk to start with. It was apparently harder to do this without someone with a transfer quirk on their team, or in general, as far as people knew. And forcing someone with a quirk to take on something new that was slow going. Not in Izuku's case. To them, he was making fast progress. If he ended up a successful subject, then, well, no one knew what would happen then. But it would work. He'd overheard that the team had gotten multiple time extensions due to this fact. The process, however, was way better in theory than in practice. It was an assortment of things, needles and examinations, and a whole bunch of things that he was never able to keep track of. All he knew was that they were hurt. The final part of the day was a stress test. It was when the subject was put under high enough stress that the quirk they were supposed to get started working to protect them. Izuku had gone through another round of needles, prodding, and shocks in an attempt to get whatever they'd tried to do to stick. All this made his current problem worse. His chest ached, and he sat on the floor, hands tugging at his hair as he curled inwards and pressed his forehead to the cold ground. White discs of the vital sensors dug into his skin. The past year there had been a permanent ache in his chest, like the inside of his bones were stuck in a low burning heat. It hurt more now than it did when he was in this room. "Stress test 6, said a voice over the intercom. The doctors were standing behind a pane of reinforced one-way glass to take notes. "Send in Nizaki." A door on the other side of the room slid open and shut. Turning his head slightly, Izuku watched one of the hardening quirk men stand at the door, cracking his neck and knuckles casually, smirking like he was finally able to do something he'd been waiting for. Izuku put his forehead back on the ground as he heard the other's shoes stomp on the floor, the dog tags on his neck making soft ting sounds with each step he took. Before he could really brace himself, Izuku was kicked in the side and sent sideways a few feet to his right. He landed on his back and made an effort to roll on his side and get up. Before he could, he was kicked in the back. Every time moving back was trying to get up, he was only to be kicked down again. Each kick made the room feel louder than it was. The only real noise in the room was Nizaki's dog tags, his footsteps, Izuku's yelps as he was kicked, and his gasp when he hit the ground. It was a cycle. The room was loudest when Izuku was on his back, the wind knocked out of him, and trying to catch his breath. He was almost to the far wall. One more kick and he'd probably hit it. He was definitely going to bruise. This was in addition to the other scrapes and slightly bleeding cuts from the day's earlier stress tests. Maybe he'd even had a concussion. With how much his head hurt, it wasn't much of a surprise. It all doubled the ache in his chest. Another kick landed on his stomach, his back hit the wall, and he was on the floor again. There was red on the floor. Did he spit that out? Nizaki was walking up in his peripheral vision, blurry and hard to see. Once he was standing over Izuku, a foot up, and ready to land down on his stomach again. Izuku crossed his arms in an X over his face as if it would actually do anything, curling in slightly. His eyes shut tight as the foot went down. There was a loud whoosh, and then Izuku felt himself get pushed harder into the ground. A loud thud echoed on the other side of the room, followed by a second sound, and the soft metal-on-metal noise of the dog tags hitting the floor. There was silence. The noise that had built up in his head had faded somewhat. Izuku slowly opened his eyes and looked over to where the sound was. Nizaki was laying on the other side of the room. The wall that he'd first got into contact with had a large dent in it. His head was fuzzy, and Nizaki wasn't clear in his vision, but he was getting up. The door on the other side of the room opened, and some of the team members rushed in. Some went to Nizaki, while a doctor hurried over to Izuku, kneeling to check if he was still breathing. The doctor was saying something to someone, and he passed out. Izuku was probably 10 years old now. He didn't know. He didn't have access to a calendar, and the days blurred together when he never got to see the sun. Izuku had stood there in the middle of Hisashi's office, tired, bruised, and confused. Dressed in black basketball shorts, a gray t-shirt, and plain white tennis shoes, after most of his quirks had properly manifested, Hisashi had thrown Izuku into harsh quirk training. The kid needed to know how to use his power without getting himself killed before he could be useful to anyone. Technically, Izuku had 3. If you asked anyone who watched his development, including him, he had 2.5. There was elemental, a control of 4 simple elements, air, water, fire, and earth. The only catch was that the element had to be present to be used. The only other one that came in handy was called Lightfoot, increased strength in his legs that would let him move faster and serve powerful kicks. The better side effect was that he didn't need to make a whole lot of sound when he walked. The worst was that he was a lighter than average person no matter what he did. It made him easier to be carried against his will. Only, the process where he got the quirks ended up being what have him the half part of the equation. With a mix of bad luck and a third stress test without a break, Izuku developed fire breathing. A quirk just like his father's, only it didn't form correctly, and thus Izuku was stuck with a self-destructive quirk. If stressed, anxious, or nervous, or was faced with anything that made him panic, smoke would form in his lungs and he'd have to exhale it. In extremely stressful situations he would shoot a decent flame at his attacker, though this has only happened twice, and it ended up with him spitting blood for 10 minutes after. Right now, though, wasn't the time to think about the quirks that he wasn't supposed to have. Right now, Izuku stood in the middle of Hizashi's office with no explanation as to why he was pulled from training. Hizashi sat back in his leather chair behind a large, heavy desk, arms crossed on the desktop and hands clasped together to paint an intimidating pose. Izuku was standing between the two chairs, situated in front of the desk. Hizashi gestured to one of the chairs, and Izuku immediately sat down. A strong silence swept the room with tension. Hizashi was smiling. By this time, Izuku sort of knew what it meant. He was planning something, and he was going to sweet-talk to make it happen. "Izuku, son, it's come to my attention that you're 10 now. Happy birthday." So he was 10. Izuku had nodded like he knew this already. "When I was your age, my father gave me a lot of responsibilities, such as taking care of my mother. As per tradition, you should have a few as well." Hizashi's chair rolled back a bit as he went to open a desk drawer. When it moved back to sit straight with the desk, Hizashi had dropped the 3 hero analysis notebooks on the desk. Izuku hadn't seen those notebooks since he was 6. Hizashi also pulled out plain paper with words and drawings in pen. Those were the things he'd seen just that morning, notes on the staff's quirks that he'd taken on stolen paper with stolen pens. They weren't extensive or detailed in any way. It was only 10 sheets of paper written in the 2 years that he'd been able to stay in his room unmonitored or unsupervised. Papers he'd hidden in the back of his dresser drawer. Someone was going through his room. Hizashi still had his sweet smile. "I want you to do what you've been doing here." One hand swept over the desk to gesture at all the notes. "I want you to write down everything you learn about heroes, their quirks, their weaknesses, how to fight them. Any and all information that you learn needs to be recorded." Izuku had learned not to show distaste or refuse an order, not from his father unless he wanted to pay for it. Thus, taught himself to keep from frowning when near Hizashi. His eyebrows did furrow slightly, an expression that Hizashi was quick to catch. "What's that face for?" Despite the innocent tone, there was an easy pull to anger that Izuku would notice if he didn't say the right thing. "Why?" Izuku's voice was quieter than it used to be. He used to have a loud, confident voice that could easily be heard. Now it just sounded small. Hizashi kept smiling and didn't frown like Izuku expected. This was off-putting. Hizashi hummed and tapped a finger on his bottom lip a few times. He was thinking about something for only a few seconds before his eyes brightened and he gave a short gasp. Like he had an idea. Instead of answering the question, however, he said, "How about your mother?" Izuku didn't really know what he was asking. His mom had nothing to do with this. She wasn't here, and he hadn't seen nor heard anything about her since he first woke up here the first time. Hizashi smiled wider. It wasn't fake sweet anymore. It was wicked. Hands bridged and elbows in the armrests of the chair, Hizashi leaned back, eyes focused on the boy. "Yes, that's what we'll do. You analyze the heroes for us, and we'll make sure Inko is safe and sound at home. Wait, why wouldn't she be safe? If you refuse, or somehow try to tell one of those damned heroes about the situation, we'll bring her here. No, we'll hurt her worse than we've hurt you. She will die, and it will be entirely your fault. You would be the one to have killed her. You wouldn't want her to die, right?" Izuku shook his head. He was on the verge of tears. He couldn't be responsible for killing her. His mom, she's done nothing to warrant that. He had to make sure she was going to be all right. That's what kids did, right? Take care of their moms? Izuku must have been thinking about it longer than Hizashi wanted. The man sighed and started tapping one of his nails on the desk, his distinctive look of impatience clear as day. Izuku picked up on this and answered quickly. "Yeah, I'll do it. Don't hurt her." Hizashi smiled. All right, everyone, this concludes the first chapter of Research to Rescue. Chapter 2 will be next. Hope you guys are enjoying this one, and as always, thank you so much for listening.